Ngayon naman, pakinggan natin ang isang presentation na manggagaling kay Christine Sumaway. Christine is a member of the Youth for United World, taga Antipolo City, and she finished Bachelor of Commerce, major in Business Economics sa University of Santo Tomas in 2018. And she graduated with honors or cum laude. At present, Christine is a third-year law student in the Ateneo Law student. Christine, it's your turn.
Hello, good afternoon po. So again, I'm Christine. I'll be sharing with you today about the 3 branches of government. It's actually more of a review than a lecture because I know that most of you are already familiar with it. We'll just tackle a bit of some of the misconceptions, etc. And I'm pretty sure most of you have more experience and knowledge than me. Bilang 25 years old pa lang po, I'm very humbled by the experience that is in this room right now. So, and I entitled my presentation, The Role of Government. So, next slide, please. We'll just take a quick look at what we're going to discuss. So, in my presentation, I included here the preamble or the introduction to the basic law or the Constitution. We're also going to look at a quick overview at the 3 branches of government altogether. And then we'll look at the qualifications that you have to have before you can run for a certain position side by side with the duties and responsibilities that each of the 3 branches of government take on. And lastly, we'll also look at the checks and balances that are imposed by the Constitution so that we make sure that each of these 3 branches do not exceed the authority given to them. So next slide, please. So the preamble is actually the introduction in the Constitution. This is actually not a source of legal obligation, but it is used to help us interpret some ambiguous provisions in the Constitution. But I did include the preamble in this presentation because it does highlight a very special and significant characteristic of a democracy, which is sovereignty resides in the people or the constituents. So our preamble actually starts off with we, the sovereign Filipino people, as a reminder that it is not the government who is above us, but it is actually the people who have the power to elect the government. So next slide, please. So what are the 3 branches of government? The 3 branches of government are the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. A common misconception is that it's actually hierarchical. So meaning to say that the executive is at the top, and then next is the legislative, and subsequently the judiciary. But that is actually a misconception. These are actually independent and co-equal branches of government. So they have their own powers, their authorities, and one cannot overpower the other. But there are a system of checks and balances to make sure that they do not exceed what is given to them by the Constitution. So back when I was in grade school or high school, my teacher actually explained to me very simply what these 3 branches of government do. So the executive is the one who executes the law, and they are composed of the president and the vice president together. The legislative, since we are a bicameral, we do adhere to a bicameral committee. We have 2 houses, which is the Senate, the 24 senators, and the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives are actually more familiar to us because these are the congressmen which we elect in our own cities. And lastly, the judiciary or the courts. So this is composed of the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, the RTCs, and the other lower courts. Just as a review, the executive is the one who executes the law, the legislative is the one who writes or makes the law, and the judiciary is the one who interprets the law. Next slide, please. So what are the qualifications do you need to comply with before you can run for an executive position? What we may not know is that positions for qualifications for president and vice president are actually the same. So you have to be a natural born citizen of the Philippines, a registered voter, who are able to read and write, should be at least 40 years of age, and you should be at least a resident of the Philippines for at least 10 years immediately preceding such election. For the last qualification, actually, you don't really have to stay in the Philippines for 10 years straight. You are still free to travel, but you must be a resident of the Philippines. So you cannot exceed 6 months outside of the country. So, along with this, we also have to look at the powers and duties, or what does the president actually do? He is at the forefront of international relations. He has the power to appoint officers, his cabinet, personal cabinet members. He also controls the executive departments. So this is the Department of Health, DepEd, etc. He also has emergency powers. Emergency powers may come in the form of declaring martial law or in other cases of emergency. He's also the commander-in-chief of the AFP, and he's also able to contract foreign loans and enter into treaties with other state parties. So, next slide, please. So I would like to share with you maybe some familiar faces who have either run as a candidate or have even been elected into such position in the executive department. So maybe some of you may not know or may not remember, but actually our FPJ actually ran for president back in 2004 against Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and he actually only lost by a million votes. That may sound like a lot, but based on percentages, it was actually only by 3% that he lost that presidential elections. So next slide, please. So for the legislative, again, we have two houses. It's composed of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Both of them do write the laws, but the only difference lies is that some bills or some laws have to or are required to originate from the House of Representatives because they are closer to the constituents or the localities. So for a senator, the qualifications are that you have to be a natural-born citizen of the Philippines. On the day of the election, you are at least 35 years of age. You are able to read and write. You are a registered voter, and you have to be a resident of the Philippines for not less than 2 years, immediately preceding the day of the election. Next slide, please. On the other hand, to be a congressman, you have to be a natural-born citizen of the Philippines. On the day of the election, you should be at least 25 years of age. And you can also be a party list representative. So party list representatives may compose of members of vulnerable communities, for example, women. So some of the bills that have to originate from the House of Representatives are all appropriation and tariff bills. This is because, again, the congressmen know better, or we presume that they know better what the needs of the constituents are because they are closer to us. Next slide, please. So these are, again, some familiar faces who have been elected to our legislative. So Juan Ponce Enrile, Manny Pacquiao, and the late Miriam Santiago. Next slide, please. So lastly, the judiciary or the courts. So for you to be a judge, you have to be a natural-born citizen of the Philippines. You have to be a member of the Philippine Bar, or in other words, you have to be a lawyer. And you have to be a person of proven competence, integrity, probity, and independence. Actually, this last, just to share with you, this last qualification is actually a little bit controversial because if you remember, one of our previous Supreme Court justices, Chief Justice Sereno, the first female justice, was actually removed from her position because she was not a person of proven integrity because she failed to pass some of her financial statements. And for you to be a Supreme Court justice, a member of the Supreme Court must be at least 40 years of age, and they must have at least 15 years of experience as a judge, or at least engaged in the practice of law for at least 15 years as well. So their duties involve interpreting the law, they declare laws and pronouncements unconstitutional, they adjudicate rights between private parties. So if, for example, I enter into a conflict with a friend, and for example, we may be fighting over a piece of land, we go to the courts for them to declare who is the actual owner of this piece of land, or if I am entitled to damages or payment of a certain amount of money. They're also, the Supreme Court is actually also the one who accepts members of the Philippine Bar or lawyers. So next slide, please. So this is actually the most feared face of the upcoming barristers or those who will take the bar this coming year. This is Justice Leonin, who is the incumbent bar examiner for this year. So next slide, please. So again, we will look at the checks and balances imposed by the Constitution to make sure that each of the branches of government will not exceed the authority given to them by the law. So the executive has, this is not actually an exclusive list, but for the executive, his checks and balances for the legislative and judiciary are respectively as follows. The executive can veto laws. That means he can say no to the proposed bills that come from the legislative. Next is that he has the final say on who to appoint as a Supreme Court justice. The Supreme Court will actually give the nominees, but the final person to be appointed will be declared by the president. For the legislative, the checks and balance for the executive is that they have the power they have to concur with the president before a treaty comes into force. So they can so the president can't just agree with another state or another country on his own. The legislative also has to concur with that before it's an official act. With the judiciary, on the other hand, they actually put limits on how the judiciary or the courts can interpret the law. If the law is clear, the judiciary cannot interpret that in any other way. And lastly, for the courts, they can actually review sufficiency of factual basis in the declaration of martial law. So this is one of the safety nets imposed after the Marcos regime era, wherein the president can unilaterally declare martial law. This time, the courts can say that maybe there is no emergency situation present, and they can halt the president from actually declaring martial law again. And they also can declare unconstitutional laws that have been passed by the legislative. So if a law or a statute is actually contrary to the basic law, the fundamental law of the Philippines, it can be struck down as unconstitutional. So last slide. So later on, we'll be breaking out into rooms
Tawagin mo si ate mo, ba't wala ng tunog, puta?
to talk amongst ourselves the answer to the question, what qualities do we look for in a public servant? But before we go to that, I would just like to share with you my personal reflection on the matter, because when I was younger, actually, as ignorant as I was, I personally believed that the person that I had to elect into the government was someone who had a lot of money. My logic behind that was because I thought if I elect someone into the government who had a lot of money, it was his or her role to actually give programs to the poor. And the more money you had, the more effective you were as a leader, because you could give outreach programs, etc. But that was actually a mistake on my part, because after, of course, going into law school, learning about what the qualifications that are needed to run for such position, and moreover, if you look at it side by side with the responsibilities that they have to do when they are in that position, it was actually very wrong, very contradictory to what I was actually thinking, because you also get to think of whether there is a disconnect between the qualifications that are imposed by law. Is there something missing, or is it correct that it is just that vague? Because when we talk about this in school, we say that we cannot add to the qualifications that are imposed by the Constitution, because it is actually a safety net to allow everyone in the community to be able to run for the position. So it cannot be anti-poor. It has to welcome everyone and allow everyone in the country an opportunity to run for government. So that is all for my part. Thank you.
Maraming salamat. Maraming salamat, Christine, for that very informative presentation. You really made us realize the functions of the three branches of government. If maybe to some of us it is a review, but maybe to some it's also something that we are trying to understand also for the first time in these days, especially as we are being confronted with a very important national exercise, in the next year.